Late summer gives way to early autumn in 1944, and the war in Western Europe appears to have found its direction. Allied armies push east with confidence shaped by months of success. Paris has fallen. German forces retreat across France, abandoning ground faster than planners once believed possible. Supply lines stretch, but morale holds. The prevailing assumption is that the enemy has lost the ability to shape events on a strategic scale. George S. Patton operates within this atmosphere of momentum. His Third Army advances aggressively, pressing for speed and freedom of maneuver. Patton views hesitation as the enemy of victory. He measures opportunity in miles gained and resistance broken. Reports suggesting that the German army might attempt a major counteroffensive strike him as disconnected from reality. The enemy, in his view, is too depleted to attempt anything ambitious. When intelligence assessments circulate warning of possible German concentrations east of the Ardennes, Patton reacts with open skepticism. The terrain is poor for large-scale operations. The roads are narrow. The weather is turning. The Germans, he believes, lack fuel, air cover, and initiative required for a decisive move. He refers to the idea dismissively, reducing it to a distraction from the real task of finishing the campaign. At higher headquarters, the picture is less certain but still restrained. Allied command acknowledges unusual movements, but struggles to define their meaning. Reconnaissance is limited by weather and distance. Prisoner interrogations yield fragments rather than clarity. Rail traffic increases in some sectors, but patterns remain ambiguous. No single report forces a reevaluation of assumptions already reinforced by success. Patton continues to push forward, focus on exploiting weakness rather than guarding against resurgence. His communications reflect impatience with caution. He argues that the enemy should be kept off balance through continuous pressure. In his assessment, any pause only allows the Germans to recover what little strength they have left. As October deepens, operations slow for reasons unrelated to enemy action. Fuel shortages limit movement. Weather degrades roads. Supply becomes a governing factor rather than resistance. Patton resents these constraints, viewing them as artificial breaks imposed by logistics rather than necessity. The war, to him, still appears winnable through audacity. Intelligence updates continue to arrive, still uneven, still incomplete. Some suggest armored formations repositioning in the east. Others note radio silence in sectors once active. Analysts debate whether these signs point to preparation or mere reorganization. The absence of clarity reinforces existing beliefs. Without visible threat, warning loses urgency. Patton remains unconvinced. He dismisses the notion of a German offensive through the Ardennes as impractical. The terrain had favored defense in 1940, but circumstances have changed. Allied air power dominates the sky. German fuel shortages are well documented. Any thrust through the forest, he argues, would be slow, vulnerable, and easily contained. The tone within Patton's command reflects this confidence. Planning focuses on continuation rather than contingency. Maps emphasize forward objectives. Defensive considerations remain secondary. The expectation is not a surprise, but of exhaustion, of an enemy retreating until resistance collapses entirely. By November, winter approaches. Snow threatens mobility. Days shorten. The Allied advance grinds forward unevenly. Despite delays, the strategic outlook remains favorable. No clear evidence forces a reassessment. The German army appears reactive, not creative. Patton's dismissal of the offensive idea hardens into routine. It becomes shorthand for what he considers misplaced caution. He continues to press for authority to maneuver freely, convinced that speed will end the war sooner than restraint ever could. Then December arrives. Weather closes and across the Ardennes. Fog settles thick between the trees. Snow blankets roads and fields. Air reconnaissance becomes unreliable. Visibility drops. These conditions, long considered obstacles to German action, now obscure Allied observation just as effectively. Early reports hint at increased activity. Small engagements multiply. Patrols encounter resistance where little was expected. Some units report armor sounds at night, engines muffled by forest and weather. The information remains fragmented, lacking the weight to force immediate action. Patton hears these reports but assigns them limited significance. To him, they confirm nervousness rather than preparation. He maintains a stance. The idea of a large-scale German strike still seems implausible. Before dawn on December 16th, the silence breaks. Artillery fire erupts across a wide front. The sound carries through fog and forest, sudden and sustained. Units are struck without warning. Communications falter. Roads fill with movement in conflicting directions. Reports surge upward faster than they can be sorted. The scope of the attack begins to emerge, piece by piece. German forces push west through the Ardennes with unexpected strength and coordination. What had been dismissed as unrealistic now unfolds in real time. Patton receives the first confirmations as the day advances. The tone of incoming messages changes. This is not a localized action. It is not a diversion. It is a concentrated effort aimed at rupture. The assessment he had rejected no longer exists as theory. It exists as fact, pressing forward through snow, fog, and surprise. Reality has shifted the ground beneath every assumption. The tone changes, not through words, but through consequence. The first hours after the attack bring disorder rather than understanding. Messages arrive rapidly, stripped of context, some contradictory, others incomplete. Units report contact, then silence. Roads, once quiet, fill with traffic, moving in opposite directions. The German advance does not reveal itself all at once. It announces itself through absence of communication, of certainty of control. Patton studies the early reports with a narrowed focus. He looks for exaggeration, for confusion mistaken as collapse. Surprise, he knows, can magnify threat before reality settles. His instinct is to assume that resistance will stiffen, and the advance will slow once the shock wears off. He expects the enemy to reveal weakness soon. But the hours pass, and the reports worsen. German armor appears where none was expected. Infantry moves with confidence through terrain assumed to be restrictive. Units meant to be resting are suddenly engaged in defensive fighting without preparation. The scale becomes harder to dismiss. This is not harassment. It is penetration. At higher headquarters, the situation sharpens quickly. The Ardennes sector, long treated as a buffer, now absorbs the weight of the attack. The front bends under pressure. What remains unclear is how far the enemy intends to go and how much strength they have committed to doing so. Patton listens to the assessments coming from the north and center. He hears concern where there had been none. He hears urgency replacing calculation. Still, he hesitates to abandon his original judgment entirely. He argues that the enemy is gambling, that the offensive cannot be sustained. Fuel and air power will decide the outcome. Time will favor the Allies. Weather denies that assumption its foundation. Aircraft remain grounded. Reconnaissance fails to deliver clarity. The sky, which Patton has always relied on as an extension of his maneuver, is absent. For the first time in months, the enemy moves without immediate consequence from the air. As December 16th turns into the 17th, German progress continues. Villages fall. Road junctions change hands. American units fight delaying actions, often without knowing whether relief exists behind them. Some hold stubbornly. Others are forced back under pressure they cannot absorb. Patton begins to revise his internal assessment, though he does not announce it. He demands more precise information from his staff. He questions assumptions rather than dismissing them outright. He studies maps not for opportunity, but for exposure, both enemy and allied. The tone within his headquarters shifts. Confidence remains, but it is no longer casual. Planning broadens. Movement options are reconsidered. Units are identified that could pivot if required. The idea of a German offensive, once reduced to irrelevance, now demands response. At the same time, pressure builds elsewhere. Commanders in threatened sectors request reinforcements. Some request authority to withdraw. The question is no longer whether the attack is real, but whether it can be contained before it reshapes the entire front. Patton receives word that the enemy's direction appears consistent, westward, toward critical river crossings. The logic is unmistakable. If successful, the thrust could split Allied forces and force a crisis beyond the battlefield. The scale of the gamble becomes clear. He does not speak of his earlier dismissal. There is no room for that. What matters now is response. He orders staff officers to examine road networks to the north. Traffic flow, bridge capacity, and march timing are evaluated under winter conditions. The work begins quietly, without formal directive. As German forces deepen their penetration, resistance stiffens unevenly. Some attacks stall against determined defense. Others slip through gaps created by surprise and terrain. The front loses definition. Control exists in pockets rather than lines. Patton recognizes the pattern. The enemy is advancing faster than they can support themselves. The thrust carries risk as well as threat. If struck correctly, it can be broken. But timing will decide whether opportunity or disaster defines the outcome. The confidence he once expressed now tightens into focus. The war has shifted. The assumptions of autumn no longer apply. Patton prepares for orders he knows will come, not because he's been told, but because the logic of the battlefield allows no alternative. By the end of December 17th, the reality is undeniable. The offensive he had dismissed as impractical has reached a scale that cannot be ignored or minimized. The tone of the war has changed, and with it the measure of every decision that follows. December 18th brings definition to what had been uncertainty. The German offensive no longer advances as rumor or isolated reports. It asserts itself through geography. Maps change shape. The front bends inward under sustained pressure, and the implications reach every level of command. Patton receives clearer confirmation of the scale. Multiple German divisions are committed. Armor and infantry move with coordination despite weather and terrain. The enemy is not improvising. This is a planned operation executed with discipline and urgency. What Patton had once labeled implausible now carries weight measured in miles and casualties. He reassesses without ceremony. There is no public reversal, no acknowledgement of earlier dismissal. The shift is internal and immediate. He turns from argument to calculation. Where can pressure be applied? Where can movement be decisive? Where does delay become failure? Reports from the center worsen. Units struggle to hold road junctions critical to lateral movement. Some formations are cut off. Others fight without clear knowledge of adjacent positions. The German advance threatens not only territory but coherence. If the front fractures further, containment may no longer be possible. Patton studies the northern axis of the enemy thrust. The deeper it goes, the more exposed its flanks become. He recognizes the same risk he once argued would doom any German offensive. Now that risk exists, but only if exploited in time. Delay favors the attacker until resistance converges. Communication intensifies between commands. The situation demands coordination beyond routine boundaries. Patton listens carefully to requests and assessments. He offers readiness rather than reassurance. He does not exaggerate capability, but he does not hedge it either. The question becomes timing. A premature movement risks confusion and exposure. A delayed response risks allowing the enemy to solidify gains. Patton presses his staff to refine movement plans, to identify units that can pivot without unraveling ongoing operations. The scale of what may be required is significant, involving entire corps under winter conditions. The weather remains hostile. Snow deepens. Roads narrow under ice and stall vehicles. Any large-scale movement will strain discipline and logistics. Patton accepts this without complaint. Difficulty is not deterrence. It is condition. As the day progresses, pressure mounts on Bastogne. Roads converge there, making it operationally decisive. American forces dig in under growing threat of encirclement. Patton tracks the situation closely, understanding its symbolic and practical weight. Losing the town would complicate relief efforts and embolden the enemy. The offensive continues to stretch German supply. Fuel shortages emerge at the edges of their advance. Captured supplies sustain momentum, but only temporarily. Patton understands that time cuts both ways. The enemy has committed fully. If stopped, they will have little left. By late December 18th, the decision he anticipated begins to form at higher levels. The crisis demands a response that alters the geometry of the battle rather than merely absorbing it. The South holds mobile strength. The North and center absorb pressure. The logic points in one direction. Patton prepares to move. He gathers senior commanders and speaks plainly. A change of direction may be ordered. Speed will matter. Discipline will matter more. Units must be ready to pivot without confusion or delay. There will be no time for adjustment once orders arrive. The tone is different from earlier briefings. There is no dismissal, no impatience with caution. There is urgency grounded in reality. The war has entered a phase where assumption yields to consequence. As night falls, German forces continue to push, but the rhythm of their advance begins to falter. Resistance stiffens. Delays multiply. The front remains dangerous, but it no longer expands unchecked. Patton senses the narrowing window. The moment for decisive movement approaches. What he had once rejected as implausible has forced a reckoning. The response now will define not only the outcome of the offensive, but the credibility of leadership under pressure. The war does not pause for reflection. Orders will come. When they do, there will be no space for hesitation. December 19th removes all remaining ambiguity. The scale of the crisis reaches the highest level of command, and with it comes a shift from assessment to action. The German offensive has achieved surprise and depth, but not decision. That space between intent and outcome becomes a battleground. Patton receives a directive he anticipated. The Southern forces must be reoriented north. The movement is not optional and not gradual. It is immediate, large-scale, and unforgiving of error. Entire formations are to pivot across frozen roads under winter conditions, maintaining cohesion while changing the axis of advance. There is no reaction beyond acknowledgement. Patton does not celebrate the opportunity or remark on the reversal of earlier assumptions. He focuses on execution. Time becomes a governing factor. Every hour saved compresses the enemy's advantage. Orders move outward rapidly. Divisions prepare to disengage from current positions without creating vulnerability. Supply columns are reassigned. Traffic control points are established to prevent gridlock. Commanders are instructed to move regardless of weather, darkness, or fatigue. The difficulty is immense. Vehicles struggle on ice-covered roads. March schedules collapse and are rebuilt in real time. Units pass each other in opposing directions, requiring discipline to prevent chaos. Patton demands adherence to order even as conditions degrade. Speed without control will destroy the effort before contact is made. As movement begins, reports from the north grow more severe. Bastogne is surrounded. Defenders hold, but relief is uncertain. The town becomes a focal point not because of symbolism, but because of geometry. Whoever controls, it controls the roads. Patton's attention narrows. He adjusts plans to prioritize contact with the encircled forces. He understands that breaking the encirclement will not end the offensive, but it will fracture the enemy's momentum and expose their vulnerability. German units sense resistance increasing. Delays accumulate. Fuel shortages worsen. The offensive, built on rapid movement, begins to strain under its own weight. Still, pressure remains intense. The outcome is not yet decided. On December 21st, Patton's lead elements approach the contested zone. Conditions remain brutal. Snow reduces visibility. Cold weakens equipment and men alike. There is no pause. The advance continues through night and day. Contact is made under fire. Engagements are sharp and localized. German units resist fiercely, aware that containment is slipping. Patton's forces press forward with limited regard for rest. Momentum becomes a weapon. Decisions are made at speed. Routes are changed under fire. Units are committed as soon as they arrive, sometimes without full coordination. The risk is accepted. Delay would cost more than disorder. On December 26th, relief reaches Bastogne. The encirclement breaks, not cleanly, but decisively. The German advance loses its coherence. What had been a spear begins to blunt. Patton does not linger on the achievement. He orders continued pressure. The objective is not merely relief, but reversal. The enemy must be forced back before regrouping is possible. The crisis reaches its turning point not in a single moment, but through accumulated consequence. The German gamble fails to produce strategic collapse. Instead, it exposes limits that cannot be repaired under pressure. Patton observes the shift with clarity rather than triumph. The offensive he once dismissed has been answered, not by dismissal, but by movement, timing, and decision. The cost is high. The risk was real. The outcome now begins to settle. The war moves forward, but it does so altered by what has been tested and proven. January settles over the Ardennes without resolving its scars. Snow still covers the ground, but the direction of movement is no longer in doubt. German forces withdraw under pressure. Trading ground for time, they no longer control. The offensive that began with surprise ends in attrition. Patton oversees a continuation with the same intensity that drove the pivot north. Relief at Bastogne has not ended the fighting. It has changed its character. What follows is not pursuit in open terrain, but reduction, methodical, costly, and resistant to shortcuts. The enemy fights hardest now to avoid collapse rather than to achieve victory. Supply conditions improve slowly. Air power returns in force, striking retreating columns in exposed positions. The advantage is decisive but not absolute. Winter remains an enemy to both sides. Vehicles fail. Men freeze. Progress is measured in villages rather than breakthroughs. Patton evaluates the outcome without indulgence. The German offensive did not succeed, but revealed vulnerabilities the Allies had underestimated. Assumptions built on momentum proved fragile when confronted with surprise and weather. The lesson is not abstract. It is written into casualty lists and delayed timetables. The cost of the crisis reshapes planning for the months ahead. Resources consumed in December cannot be replaced quickly. Units require rest and refit. The broader advance into Germany resumes, but without the illusion of inevitability that defined the autumn. The war remains dangerous even as its end approaches. Within command circles, Patton's role in the response becomes clear. He did not predict the offensive, and he did not prevent its initial success. What defines his contribution is adaptation. When theory failed, he shifted without hesitation. Movement replaced argument. Execution replaced opinion. The phrase he once used to dismiss the idea of a German strike no longer matters. The battlefield has rendered judgment more effectively than reflection ever could. What remains is the consequence of response under pressure. German forces, having spent their last reserve of initiative, cannot repeat the gamble. The Ardennes drain strength that cannot be recovered. From this point forward, resistance becomes delay rather than design. As winter advances, the front straightens. The bulge recedes into history, leaving behind frozen ground and altered understanding. The crisis that threatened rupture instead accelerates exhaustion on one side and caution on the other. Patton does not frame the episode as vindication or reversal. It becomes part of the larger burden of command. Confidence, he learns again, must be balanced by readiness to abandon it when reality intrudes. The cost of delay is measured not in pride, but in lives. The Allied advance continues toward the Rhine, slower, steadier, and more alert. The war's end draws closer, shaped by moments when certainty collapsed and decision filled the gap. In the winter of 1944, an idea dismissed as impossible forced a reckoning. The tone of the war changed not because the enemy succeeded, but because assumption failed. What endured was not prediction, but response.